Was one of the first modern critics to suggest that Homer might not have been an author in the contemporary sense of a single person who sat down and wrote a story and then published it for others to read. In his 1781 essay on the origin of languages, the Swiss philosopher suggested that the Odyssey and Iliad might have been written only in men's memories. Somewhat later, they were laboriously collected in writings, though that was about as far as his inquiry into the matter went. Also writing in the 18th century, an English diplomat and archaeologist named Robert Wood suggested that Homer was illiterate and that his works had to have been committed to memory. It was a revolutionary theory, but Wood couldn't back it up with a hypothesis that explained how Homer might have pulled off such an astounding mnemonic feat. In 1795, the German philologist Friedrich August Wolff argued for the first time that not only were Homer's works not written down by Homer, but they also weren't even by Homer. They were rather a loose collection of songs transmitted by a generation of Greek bards and only redacted in their present written form at some later date. In 1920, an 18-year-old scholar named Milman Perry took up the question of Homeric authorship as his master's thesis at the University of California, Berkeley. He suggested that the reason Homer's epics seemed unlike other literature was because they were unlike other literature. Perry had discovered what Wood and Wolff had missed. The evidence that the poems had been transmitted orally was right there in the text itself. All those stylistic quirks, including the formulaic and recurring plot elements and the bizarrely repetitive epithets, clever Odysseus and gray-eyed Athena, that had always perplexed readers, were actually like thumbprints left by a potter, material evidence of how the poems had been crafted. They were mnemonic aids that helped the bards fit the meter and pattern of antiquity took the meter pattern of line and remember the essence of the poems. The greatest author of antiquity was actually Perry argued, just one of the long tradition of oral poets that composed wholly without the aid of writing. Perry realized that if you were setting out to create memorable poems, the Odyssey and the Iliad were exactly the kind of poems you'd create. It said that the cliches are the worst sin a writer can commit, but to an oral bard, they are essential. The very reason that cliches so easily seep into our speech and writing, their insidious memorability, is exactly why they are played such an important role in oral storytelling. And the Odyssey and Iliad, excuse the cliches, are riddled with them. In a culture dependent on memory, it's critical, in the words of Walter Ong, that people think memorable thoughts. The brain best remembers things that are repeated, rhythmic, rhyming, structured, and above all easily visualized. The principles that the oral bards discovered as they sharpened their stories through telling and retelling were the same basic mnemonic principles that psychologists rediscovered when they began constructing their first scientific experiments on memory around the turn of the 20th century. Words and rhymes are much more memorable than words that don't. Concrete nouns are easier to remember than abstract nouns. Dynamic images are more memorable than static images. Iteration aids memory, and stripped skunk making a slam dunk, and a stickier thought than a patterned must yield engaging in athletic activity. The most useful of all mnemonic tricks employed by the bards was song. As anyone who has ever found himself chanting my Menem can attest, if you can turn a set of words into a jingle, they can become exceedingly difficult to knock out of your head. Finding patterns and structure in information is how our brains extract meaning from the world. And putting words to music and rhyme are a way of adding extra levels of pattern and structure to language. It's the reason Homeric bards sang their epic oral poems. The reason the Torah is marked up with little musical notations. And the reason we teach kids the alphabet in song and not 26 individual letters. Song is the ultimate structuring device for language. After moving to Harvard and becoming an assistant professor, Perry took an unconventional turn in his work. Rather than hunkering down with old Greek texts, the young classicist took off for Yugoslavia in search of the last bards who still practiced a form of oral poetry resembling the Homeric arts. He returned to Cambridge with thousands of recordings that formed in his fieldwork. Perry found that rather than transmitting the text itself from bard to bard, the generation to generation, the contemporary Balkan rhapsodists, presumably like their ancient Homeric predecessors, would impart a set of formulaic rules and constraints that allowed any bard, to reconstruct the poem each time he recited it. Each retelling of the story was not exactly like the one that came before, but it was close. When the Slavic bards were asked where they repeated their songs exactly. They responded word for word and line for line. And yet, when recording two performances were held up against each other, they were clearly were different. Words changed, lines moved around, passages disappeared, and the Slavic bards weren't being overconfident. They simply had no concept of verb atem recall. Not that this should have been surprising. Without writing, there's no way to check whether something has been repeated exactly. The variability that is built into the poetry of oral traditions allows the bard to adapt the material to the audience, but it also allows for memorable versions of the poem to arise. Folklorists have compared oral poems to pebbles worn by the water. They made smooth. They're made smooth over many easy retellings as the